You pick up the story and you go right from there.
Okay, well, as usual, I try to make some sort of comment on issues of the day before getting into my most recent book, The Power Elite, Their History and Future. And several things popped up that we've talked about before, but now I guess they're made legitimate because certain entities have suggested it may be true. We for many years have talked about the dangers of fluoride, for example, and I suppose one of the main things was in my book, The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan, where there was an indication that during the 30s, the Nazis had used fluoride in the conquered territories to make the people there more docile. It affects a particular part of the brain that makes you more willing to accept authority, and there are other dangers, of course. But more recently, we have a couple of things coming out of some major medical journals. For example, in March 11th of this year, you had some studies that would show, for example, that the previous month, in February, government and some top university studies that fluoride lowers the IQ and causes other health problems. And now, in the next month, in March, you had an indication that a Harvard study found that fluoride lowered children's IQs by 7 points, and that numerous government reports have shown that fluoride can injure the brain.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment with Dr. Dennis Cuddy. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, and now that we've got Dr. Cuddy with us. Dr. Cuddy certainly is well-known, internationally known. He was with the Department of Education during the Reagan years. He's taught at the university level. He's been a consultant for industry. But fortunately, he's with us today to bring us up to date on many of the things that are going on. We do carry his books. But Dr. Cuddy is simply pointing out that there's a recent study came out of Harvard, pointing out the deleterious effects of water fluoridation, how it lowers intelligence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can go up on the internet and check this out. They're poisoning you. They're poisoning your children. And yet you're not going to read about this in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Denver Post. You're not going to hear about it in Time Magazine. They're poisoning your children. They know exactly what they're doing. Dr. Cuddy, why don't you discuss this amazing new research that's come out just in the last couple of months, being totally suppressed by the controlled media?
Sure. Well, the first one, I guess, would be about 3 months ago, February. A Harvard study found that the fluoride can lower children's IQ by 7 points, and that there have been numerous government reports showing fluoride can injure the brain and neurological systems. And then in the next month, March, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, Lancet, it's a British medical journal, published a Harvard study showing that fluoride is one of the chemicals that can increase autism and attention deficit disorder, ADD as well. So it's both of those things. And they specifically talked about it being a toxin, a neurotoxin. There was the February study indicating there were drastic reductions in IQs. And then what that means is when Lancet classified the chemical fluoride as a harmful neurotoxin, it puts it in the same sort of category as lead and mercury and arsenic and other toxins. And so now everybody's just sort of paying attention. I remember, I think, a day or two ago, Rush Limbaugh was saying how there was this fellow who he didn't think much of because the fellow kept calling up and talking about conspiracies. Of course, Rush tries to repeatedly tell people there are no conspiracies, he doesn't believe in them. And this guy kept talking about fluoride in the water and other conspiracies, and so it must not be true because the guy believed in conspiracies. And then Rush Limbaugh said all of a sudden here recently, within the last few days, he sees that Harvard is now saying that there is a real problem with fluoride. And so now Rush is saying...
Hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment.
God bless
This is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, and our guest, Dr. Dennis Cuddy, is talking about this recent publication in Lancet magazine out of Harvard showing that they're poisoning us with the fluoride. Dennis, you pick up the story and take it from there.
Yeah, it's classified as a neurotoxin now by these people, which puts it like there with lead and arsenic and other things, which are, Dr. Stan said, deleterious. I guess arsenic is going to kill you, and quickly. But it seems that only when Lancet, British publication, talks about a Harvard study do people pay attention. But we've talked about the deleterious effects of fluoride for many years, and including all the way back to when the Nazis were using it in the conquered territories to make the people more docile. It affects a particular part of the brain. The Nazis had identified it as affecting a particular part of the brain which has one resist or non-resistance, and it sort of made a person non-resistant.
Hey, Dave, can you come out here because this machine is not working?
And so what they find is that now all of a sudden people like Rush Limbaugh are starting to believe this, as opposed to before when it was only, he said, this conspiracy person who would talk about such things. But now he's paying attention, and hopefully a lot of other people will pay attention as well. Another thing which is in the news recently, and people seem to think this is some new thing, but it's really not, is on May 22, you had a lot of news talking about Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel talking about the emergence of a new world order. It was when he was on his visit to Poland. He said, quote, "It's a time that we are seeing a new and early 21st century world order being built." In other words, a new world order and a 21st century world order. That was at the 223rd anniversary of Poland's constitution that he said that. And everybody's sort of calling attention to it. Oh, look, Chuck Hagel's talking about new world order. But what you have to remember is this is something rather consistent. And that's why Chuck Hagel has been acceptable to the power elite for a long time, because over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago, back in late January of last year, 2013, what you find is that Chuck Hagel was using the same sort of language. He called himself at that time telling the new president when Barack Obama was coming. Chuck is saying, well, back when the new president, Barack Obama, came along, quote, this is what Chuck Hagel is recalling that he told Barack Obama as a new president, quote, "We are at a time where there is a new world order. We don't control it. You must question everything, every assumption, everything they," meaning the military and diplomats, "tell you. Any assumption 10 years old is out of date. You need to question our role. You need to question the military. You need to question what we're using the military for," end quote. And so Chuck Hagel, for many years, this is like a year ago when he's recalling talking to the new president, which would be, 2009, about this new world order. And so it's very, very much like Joe Biden, who's now the vice president. Back when he was in the Senate, when Joe Biden was in the Senate, Bill Clinton had just been elected in late January. He was discussing as chairman, I believe, of the Foreign Relations Committee with Warren Christopher, who was Bill Clinton's nominee for Secretary of State. Joe Biden says, well, how are we going to continue the new world order? Because President George H.W. Bush was just leaving office, and he had made a big deal about the, quote, new world order. And back and forth in their discussion, Senator Biden and Warren Christopher said, well, looks like maybe we could make NATO a peacekeeping surrogate for the UN. The UN did not have a good reputation, but NATO did, so that's how they were going to continue the new world order. Now, Joe Biden is no longer a senator. He's a vice president, but the same sort of attitude and reference to this point has been used for years now by Chuck Hagel. So the term is not dead. It hasn't been used as much as when George H.W. Bush was using it, because I'm sure somebody eventually told him that the New World Order, that term had a real history to it. H.G. Wells had written a book by that title, and so forth and so on. But anyway, it's sort of a code, and it shows you're acceptable, whether it's Joe Biden using it or Chuck Hagel using it, as far as the power lead is concerned. And then one other thing I just want to reiterate. I talked last week about Common Core, and what I mentioned with the problems with it, its background, who's behind it, and I may write one of my news with views columns about that. But I didn't emphasize enough that it is a data collection machine, a data collection device, in which they ask all kinds of intrusive questions about, they'll have codes for your religious background, all of these things. Well, in passing, I was having a talk with a physician today, and he comes to our home. There's an organization called Doctors Making House Calls, and because my mother just a week ago, Sunday, became 90 years old, he comes to her home. It's easier for him to come to the home rather than for her to go to the doctor's office. And we were talking about, he and I, about Obamacare, and he has some real reservations about Obamacare, Medicare, what they're doing with it. And so we were discussing this sort of Medicare pilot program whereby if you go to the hospital, as soon as you get out of the hospital, the doctor comes and sees you, or his colleague comes and sees you to check to see how you are once you've gotten out of the hospital. And this doctor, who's a fine fellow, this one he's rather sharp. He knows what's going on with Obamacare. He said, what this is a data collection device. I said, that's exactly what Common Core is in education. And so we were talking back and forth about why they're counting all this data. And he said, well, Medicare says they're comparing it to, in a control group to so forth and so on. And I said, what I suspect? I suspect this data collection that they're doing is going to be eventually used by these, quote, death panels. And he understood what I was talking about, and he sort of smiled and said, he sort of nodded his head, and he said, yeah, they're looking at a comparison of the medications and what's effective and what's not, and so forth and so on. I said, in other words, they're finding out, something like what's going to kill Granny quicker. How are we going to assist Granny in dying? And then he got into the whole definition of what they're using hospice for. Now, people have had some experiences with hospice, and I don't want to get into all the pros and cons of hospice, but he said there's some sort of regulation whereby if you call hospice in, then the government starts, collecting data about who lasts how long and so forth and so on, and what kind of medications are used. And I said, oh, yeah, they're doing all that sort of stuff. And I reminded him, if he didn't already know it, about Barack Obama's czars. He has he has about 22, 24 czars, different areas. But his regulatory czar, his name begins with an S, and there's another one, Holdren, or something like that. But I was reminding him that I've written articles in the past, the News with Views, how one of these czars literally has been published as saying that if there's a person who the government determines is terminally ill, you can actually harvest their body parts without their permission before they're dead. If they're terminally ill, or maybe it's in a coma or something like that. And I said, that's horrible. And we both understood, that is their attitude. And the guy's not been fired. He wasn't fired for making these statements. In fact, he was hired after he made some of those statements. So the future is fitting perfectly with the secret Nazi plan, because, that's what the Nazis were doing before they had the Holocaust, as it's called, against the Jews. They were getting rid of people with various handicaps, people with mental handicaps, physical handicaps, and so on. And they actually justified it in sort of mathematical terms. They would say, well, if this person is allowed, quote, allowed to die, then we can build, so many little houses for the Aryan race that we're preparing. And so it was all rationalized along those lines, and so it fits. It just fits perfectly. And unfortunately, most people have no idea. They see and they argue whether it's Common Core or Obamacare in terms of the actual harm that it's doing with not containing the cost, rising cost of medical care, or the things that they are doing and not doing, and the limitations, and how it may have a short supply of whatever it is. Therefore, certain people are going to be, quote, allowed to die. And you